Hey, my friend, and welcome to Aligned to Rise, the podcast for ambitious women who are ready to rise above their symptoms, release old limitations, and fully rise into their true power and potential. I'm your host, Alyssa Chavez, functional nutritionist, performance coach, and former endo and infertility warrior who knows what it's like to feel held back by your body and your beliefs. I've taken a journey of true healing from the inside out so that I can show up feeling great in my body, confident and unstoppable. And now I'm here to help you do the same. Through a blend of functional nutrition and deep mindset work, this show will empower you to reclaim your vitality, trust your intuition, and live unapologetically in your purpose. If you're ready to align your body, mind, and spirit so you can rise to your highest potential, you're in the right place. Let's rise, my friend. This show was created for educational purposes only and should not be used as a replacement for medical advice or treatment. Hey, my friend, and welcome back to Aligned to Rise. I have a fantastic guest for you all today. Her name is Kara Becker, and she and I actually met because we're actually both graduated now, but at the time had been training together through the Functional Nutrition Academy with Erin Holt and learning all kinds of fabulous things. So we were able to connect with each other through that. And I just knew that I had to have her on the podcast because, for one, Kara has such a fantastic story about her own fertility journey, which I knew I had to have her on to share about that. And she also is doing some really wonderful work with metabolic health and working with continuous glucose monitors and some really fantastic tools that can be so helpful for everybody in their own health journeys. So I just knew I had to have her on the podcast here. Kara is a functional medicine health coach, and she really loves to help her clients based on their own unique bio-individuality, which if you listen to the podcast any length of time, you know that that's definitely a huge piece for me as well, a huge foundation of the work that I do. And I love how she has applied that to her own practice. So Kara has been through programs with the Institute for Integrative Nutrition and, as I mentioned, the Functional Nutrition Academy. She's also board certified by the Center for Credentialing and Education as a certified health coach and a certified functional medicine practitioner. So she has so many wonderful gems to share with you. Truly, I had so much fun in this conversation. Kara is just so fabulous to talk to, and I just love that I get to share these conversations with all of you. So without further ado, I will let Kara take it away. All right. Well, hi, Kara. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm excited that you're here.
Hi, Alyssa. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I love, we've been chatting behind the scenes here and I've been loving hearing about everything that you're doing and, everything that you're bringing to the table. So I'm excited to chat about that today. But I would love if we can start off by just hearing a little bit about who you are, where you came from, what your journey has been like, and how you came to be doing what you're doing now.
Sounds good. So right now I'm practicing as a functional medicine health coach, which I love. I love what I do. I love meeting with my clients and my patients and really helping them through their journeys. And it's really relevant for me because I got inspired to be in this field because of my own journey. I actually started my career in counseling, working with students in higher education for a while. And it was when my husband and I decided to start our family and we were experiencing a lot of issues with infertility that I started to learn a lot more about functional medicine and about holistic health and just about what's going on with our bodies and having a greater understanding of the interconnectedness that our bodies are. We're so used to this perspective where we treat every system on its own and each symptom as its own problem to solve. And it was through my journey with infertility that was pretty long and arduous and complicated that I started to learn more about why I was experiencing infertility and how everything in my body was connected. and instead of just treating the infertility itself. And so it was at that time, several years ago, that I really made this major change personally, with my own health and wellness, really trying to understand the interconnectedness of my nutrition, my stress, my sleep, my movement, my environmental influences on my infertility and on my body and my balance and everything. We had a long journey. We have our 2 kids from that journey. And it really shaped, I think my career path moving forward, which is a beautiful thing. I made a career change. I used my counseling background, which was a great fit for me, but I was like, I need to serve a different population. This just wasn't really working for me anymore. And so I started learning more about health coaching and about functional medicine from a more educational perspective. I got certifications in both, and I started working with clients and patients first with fertility issues, and now I've expanded to women's health and to really health in general. I'm working right now in a practice that really sees patients from their 20s to their 80s.
Oh, fantastic. That's so cool. I love that so many of us in this holistic health space really did get into it from our own journeys, our own experiences, because really there's so many people who are struggling with underlying things with their health and just not getting the answers they need from other sources, and so just are looking deeper. Now, if you don't mind sharing, because I know there's so many people out there who are struggling with fertility, and it's so lovely to hear that you had a positive outcome with that you now have beautiful kids of your own. But if you don't mind sharing a little bit more about that journey, like what you discovered for yourself was really helpful for you to be able to have a family. I think people would really love to hear about that.
Yeah, definitely. So my initial diagnosis was PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is basically presents as irregular cycles, elevated androgens, and polycystic ovaries on an ultrasound. Usually you have to have 2 of the 3 criteria for that diagnosis. I had the irregular cycles and I had the presentation on ultrasound. I did not have the elevated androgens. So it was always very confusing to me, like, why I'm being classified as this patient just because I had 2 of the 3, but like really one of the main aspects of it I didn't have. And so I was worked up as that type of profile, but a lot of their tricks for PCOS patients weren't working. So a lot of the infertility treatments that they thought would be effective were not. And so I went down a lot of rabbit holes with my doctor on my own, trying to understand what really was going on with my personal picture. And I discovered that really my PCOS was driven by more of this inflammation type of PCOS. So I actually later learned through my training that there are 4 types of PCOS. And so while the insulin resistant PCOS is the most common, that really wasn't my presentation. My insulin was actually normal, if not optimal. And so it really was driven by this low-grade chronic inflammation that kept coming up actually on my lab markers. But no one was really making those connections. And I kept pointing that out. Like, I think that there's inflammation. And I didn't really understand it at the time because I hadn't gone through any of the training. So it's like, I just kept saying, I remember to the doctor, like, I have inflammation. And she was like, we all have inflammation. I was like, no, but I think mine is different. It's the roadblock here. And I realized now that I was starting to really gain that perspective of this whole body approach, and that, inflammation really drives a lot of dysfunction in our bodies. So what I did instead was I did a lot of work on myself to lower inflammation in my body, a lot of like dietary changes, a lot of like stress and nervous system support, which I think was a big thing for me. And everybody says during infertility, like, don't stress, which is the worst thing somebody can tell you. But really, from a clinical perspective, like the stress has a major impact on the body, because our bodies won't allow itself to conceive if it thinks that it's in a state of danger, right? And so really showing your body that it's safe and that everything is okay is really important. So I did a lot of work there too. I did also have like a little bit of an element of insulin resistance. I didn't have actual insulin resistance, but I definitely had some like blood sugar mismanagement things going on. So I did a lot of work with that and just like understanding my body's personal response to different carb intake and how it impacts my blood sugar. And so I learned a lot there. So I really did a lot of optimization. And I think it's what, led to my success in the end. But it was a several year journey. It definitely wasn't
Sure.
like something that happened overnight.
Yeah. One thing I think is so interesting, though, I feel like so often in the conventional model, we're really only taught that if there's infertility, it must be related to your hormones. This is something that I hear all the time. If you're struggling to get pregnant, you got to work on your hormone health. And I think it's cool that you didn't even mention your hormones other than the fact that your androgens were normal. And I think that's such an important message for people to hear because especially with PCOS, we hear a lot about the androgens and for some people that is absolutely a thing, right? There is the androgen side of it, which oftentimes you're having the symptoms related to that, like the acne, the facial hair growth, the loss of hair on your head, some of those androgenic type symptoms can certainly be a thing for people. But I love that the main thing that you were talking about, which definitely can be true for so many people, is the inflammation and the metabolic health and all of the things that can. And I definitely want to highlight also how you were talking about how important it is for your body to feel safe.
Mhm.
Such a big thing that nobody really talks about.
Right. No, no doctor ever mentioned that to me.
No.
If anything, they knew I was in the most stressed out state and they were like, let's just keep going, right? They
Totally.
never said, let's take a pause or a break.
Totally. Let's just give you
Mhm.
some more medications and see how you feel is often the
Right.
story there. So, gosh, I feel like there's so much to unpack here. Where shall we begin? Let's actually start off. I definitely want to talk about metabolic health in general. I know you've been doing some great work on that lately and have been really exploring some things with that. So we'll definitely have that conversation. But I would love, because I know we have some listeners here who struggle with PCOS, I would love if you can start off with that conversation, just talking a little bit more, because you mentioned that even there's 4 types of PCOS, which I don't think is something everybody is aware of. I would
Mhm.
love if you can just speak a little more to just if you've had a PCOS diagnosis or maybe even just suspect that you potentially have PCOS, what are some of those things you want to look for potentially on lab work? Or you mentioned there's a few criteria that we want to look at. And how would you go about figuring out what type of PCOS that you have and so that you kind
Mhm.
of have an idea of what to do about it?
Definitely. This was such news to me too when I learned this, and I know you and I come from similar training, so
Mm-hmm.
it was really eye-opening. And I remember counting down till this training because I was like, I want to learn more about when the PCOS module opens up. So there's 4 main types of PCOS. So the insulin resistant PCOS, that's like the classical PCOS that, many of us, if we have that, are familiar with. And it's really characterized by those irregular or absent cycles, the high androgens, which is like the high testosterone or DHEA, those like sex hormones. There can be weight gain associated with it, or like weight loss resistance. But it's possible to have this at a normal body weight as well. And on your labs, you'll often see like elevated androgens and elevated insulin. Another type of PCOS is the post birth control PCOS. So that's when you come off of birth control. There's actually this like hormone rebound that happens. And it's almost like your hormones are having trouble like rebalancing from being suppressed for so long. And so if you have high androgens right after birth control, it could actually just be a side effect of coming off the birth control pill, and it may just pass with time. And so you might have elevated androgens on your labs, but I believe your insulin typically is normal because there's not that like insulin resistance going on. And we can talk later more about like insulin
Oh,
resistance to
yeah. We'll dig into
clarify
that
all
for
that.
sure.
Yeah. And so that can be a temporary state. And sometimes people just don't wait long enough to see if things rebound, especially if they're trying to conceive. Then there's the adrenal PCOS. So this is more from like a ramped up stress response, where your adrenals are cranking out a lot of cortisol, which is your stress hormone. But because all of our hormones are connected, right, in our endocrine system, everything is connected, it has this kind of downstream effect on other hormones. So it can make imbalance from this like extreme stress response. And so these patients might have irregular cycles, they might have high androgens, They might have normal insulin. So insulin is a really important lab marker always to check. And they might have like a imbalanced cortisol production. For these people, I think it's really important to just find out what their day-to-day lives look like. Like, are you under significant stress? Is there something, is your job, other kids, like how are you kind of perceiving stress in your life? If
Mm-hmm.
it's like a debilitating, crippling stress, like it could be an adrenal PCOS type of picture. Interestingly, though, the body perceives stress in many ways. So it could be from like an emotional stress, but stress on the body can be coming from like a physical stressor too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where working with a clinician can be really helpful to kind of see like what could be driving like a high stress response in the body. And then the last one is the inflammatory PCOS. So that's I think where I fell in. Now you don't necessarily have to just have one, like you can have actually aspects of others too. So it's not as clear cut as, oh, which one of the four types. But I think my
Yeah.
main driver was the inflammatory version. So that's where this chronic inflammation in the body can actually impact hormone output. And so for these patients, you would have irregular cycles and you would have signs of inflammation. So, like maybe an elevated CRP, which is a lab marker that we look at often. That lab marker, it was always elevated for me. And no
Mm-hmm.
one was questioning it. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. um, but like elevated CRP or like some elevated inflammatory markers, maybe on labs, or maybe like in just symptom presentation, but normal insulin, right? Maybe there's not that
Mhm.
like insulin resistance going on. So those are the
Yeah.
four types.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I know that was definitely very enlightening for me when I learned that also. Just, we think of PCOS being a diagnosis, but knowing that there are multiple types, there's different places that it can be coming from, I think is so important to know. And it really comes back to the whole idea of bio-individuality, which I talk about a lot on this podcast, that, there's not a one size fits all solution, whether it's PCOS or really anything going on in your body. It's important to really understand what's going on for you in your unique body. What are the underlying factors that can be influencing the way that you feel? Because that way you're tailoring whatever you're doing with diet, with supplements, with lifestyles, changes, all of the things that you're doing. You
Right.
want to be able to customize that and tailor that to your body and your lived experience rather than just kind of those generalized catch-all solutions that so many people talk about. So, yeah, that
Right.
gets super helpful.
Yeah. And also, the hormones are actually more of a downstream
Yes.
impact of what's going on in the body. So, what that means is that the hormones are actually often responding to something. So, like you said earlier, it's not always that the hormones are the issue, it's the hormones are just reacting to whatever is going on. So, is it a source of inflammation? Is it the
Mhm.
chronic stress, right? Is it coming off birth control? The hormones just react.
Yep. 100%. All right. Now, you've mentioned some things about insulin and metabolic health, and I would love if we can start to dive into that stuff a little bit more because it certainly can be a driving factor with PCOS, but I find that it's something that really impacts so many people, whether you've had some sort of diagnosis or not. I think having an understanding of metabolic health and how that impacts your life and your body and all the things is such a powerful thing. Honestly, this is one of the top things that there's so many things we've learned along the way as practitioners, right? All about digestion and nutrition and all the things. But honestly, if there were one thing that I wish they taught you in school, it would be understanding your metabolic health. Like more people need
Yeah.
to understand this stuff because it has such wide ranging impacts. I know even speaking from my own personal journey, truly, I thought that markers like insulin and HbA1c and just metabolic health in general, I really thought that that only mattered if you had diabetes. And I think
Mhm.
that so many people think that way. And when I really started to dig in and learn about all of this and just how blood sugar management can impact all of us on a day to day basis, it was so powerful. So
Yeah.
I would love if you can, let's even kind of start from the basics here. What is metabolic health and why does it matter?
Yeah. So there's actually not a great definition that I've come across of metabolic health. It's kind of generally defined as the absence of metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is a group of health conditions that can negatively impact your metabolic health, right? So it's kind of like the opposite. But even the criteria for that isn't super consistent. I work with several doctors at my practice, and I feel like they, across them, don't have a consistent definition. It's more like lab markers that we're looking at that would characterize somebody as having metabolic syndrome. Some of the things that would contribute to somebody having metabolic syndrome would be a lot of those lifestyle factors. So, like sedentary lifestyle, being overweight, having abdominal weight, like weight around the midsection, poor diet, high caloric intake. Genetics can play a role, insulin resistance, having chronic inflammation, like all the things that we mentioned, all of these can contribute to developing metabolic syndrome. I would say diet and lifestyle are just the major contributors to it. And you can really reverse a lot of metabolic syndrome with changes in those areas.
So important to know.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody were, you mentioned that there's lab markers that can help you to look at this. Can you talk us through a little bit of just what are those key lab markers you'd want to look at? I know you mentioned insulin before. What would be those key lab markers, and what would you really be looking for on those?
Yep. So insulin is definitely one that we would look at, but really before that, we were looking at somebody's fasting glucose and their HbA1c. So your fasting glucose would be the amount of glucose in your bloodstream when you first wake up in the morning when you're on an overnight fast. So your blood sugar should be, your body likes to keep your blood sugar in a tight range. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you're outside of that range, if you're too high or too low, it's showing that your body's having a hard time keeping it in that desired range. And then your blood sugar will fluctuate throughout the day based on what you eat. But in the morning when you wake up, it should be at a certain level because you've fasted overnight. And then your A1C is actually an average of your overall blood sugar for the past like 2 to 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives us an average of what's been happening over that time. And so that also we want to make sure it's under a certain number so that it shows within reason, like we have to, do more detective work and make sure that the average is not pulled to the middle because of a lot of highs and a lot of lows, right? That the
Mm-hmm.
average is still where we want it to be because we're in the average range. And so we want to make sure that it's, within that point.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it is good to know because for most people, I feel like unless you have some specific reason to look into your blood sugar deeper, for many people on just your conventional lab work that's run once a year, oftentimes you'll only see the fasting glucose level. I know that was the case for me for many years until I ended up going into this world and now am able to just order my own blood work so I can get whatever markers done that I want. But for many years, the only thing that was ever checked was fasting glucose, and it always was fine. And so no one ever bothered to dig deeper. But I like what you said about that, though, how basically we're looking at what your blood sugar level is after that overnight fast first thing in the morning, but it is also just that snapshot in time. You're seeing what your glucose level is right now in the moment, which gives us some information, but it's definitely not the whole picture. So I think that is important to know, whereas markers like HbA1c and even insulin gives us a little bit more history on how your body has been doing with that. So, and then also I think it's important to mention the whole, optimal versus, conventional ranges, just because with conventional ranges for HbA1c, they're basically looking at, are you pre-diabetic, diabetic, or not? And if you're underneath that pre-diabetic range, they're usually going to not even mention it. Whereas for us, looking from the optimal perspective, we would really like to see that HbA1c quite a bit lower than what they would be asking for in a conventional doctor's office. Because, for me, I would be looking for ideally that HbA1c being 5.2 or below, which is quite a bit lower than the pre-diabetic range. If you're looking for optimal health, which, if you're here, you probably are.
Right.
Now, one thing that I know you've really gotten into lately that I would love to talk about more is being able to really track your glucose levels on a more regular, continuous basis. Because when we're talking blood work, we're talking a single blood draw on one day when you'd be looking at those markers like your glucose, your insulin, your HbA1c, which is absolutely a good place to start. If you go into your doctor and just request those three markers and take a look at them and see how those ranges are, that's a fantastic place to start. If you're interested in looking into your metabolic health and you haven't looked into that, absolutely start there. But for somebody who feels like this is potentially an issue, they're noticing some changes, they're having some symptoms come up in their body. I know one thing that you've gotten into recently, which I'm super interested to hear more about, is doing continuous glucose monitoring. So I would love if you can share a little bit about what that is for anyone who might not be familiar and why that's something that can be helpful for you.
Definitely. I've been loving working with the continuous glucose monitors. So CGM for short, so I'll just use that term to make it easier. It's a monitor that actually you place on the back of your arm. You kind of just insert it with an applicator, and it has a teeny tiny needle that you don't even feel. You wouldn't even know it's there. It goes into the interstitial fluid, so it's the top layer, not even into the bloodstream, and it lives on the back of your arm for 14 days about, and it tracks your blood sugar in real time. So you have an app on your phone that you can pull up at any point and see what your blood sugar is doing. So you can actually get a reading of that fasting blood sugar in the morning. You can get your own A1C or average over the 2-week period. So you can get your average of what's happening. And then you can see what's happening with each meal that you eat, how your body is reacting to that meal. So as I mentioned earlier, our bodies like to keep our blood sugar in a tight range. So it's somewhere between like 70 and 140. That would be like optimal. And so if you're finding that your blood sugar is frequently going above that range or below that range, we want to dig deeper into what's going on. Is there some sort of insulin resistance brewing? Is it just the dietary choices that you're making, right? Because meals that are going to be very high in carbohydrates are going to have like more of a reaction on the blood sugar. Is it the caloric intake? Is it the composition of the meals? Like, is it actually factors that aren't even related to diet? So is it stress induced, right? Like sometimes periods of stress can cause the body to release stress hormones, which then has the body release glucose, and then you see the blood sugar go up. Is it related to sleep? If we're not sleeping well, we can see imbalances with the blood sugar. So it gives us a lot more data to start to understand where the breakdowns are happening. And actually, there's research that says that the stage can start to be set for diabetes 10 to 15 years before you actually get a diagnosis. Wow. So there can be some insulin resistance starting and you don't even know it, right? And your lab markers are normal because it takes time for those markers to then start to get dysfunctional and to see a problem.
Yeah. Now, we've talked a little bit about insulin resistance, and I feel like that's a term that's probably becoming more commonly known than it used to be, which is great. But for anybody listening who is just questioning like, okay, I've heard that, but I don't really know exactly what that is. Can you share with us a little bit more about that? What exactly is insulin resistance?
Yep. So when you eat something, let's say, just to simplify it, let's say you eat a piece of bread, right? Then that bread will break down in the body into glucose and it will release into the bloodstream and be floating around in the bloodstream. And then as a reaction to that, the pancreas will then send out insulin. And insulin's job is to go and basically push the glucose into the cells. And the reason for that is that it's for energy. So really carbs are like our primary energy source. So the insulin comes and it takes that glucose and it puts it into the cells to give you energy, right? But what happens is because the standard American diet specifically is so carb heavy, we're really giving our body way more carbs than it actually needs for energy. And so the insulin, which is that key that puts the gets the glucose into the cells, it stops working as well, right? Mm-hmm. There's some sort of breakdown that happens because we're asking the insulin to work so hard to get all of this glucose into the cells. And so now the key is not fitting into the cell doors correctly, leaving the glucose stuck outside. And so now the body has to send out more and more insulin to keep up, to get the glucose to where it's supposed to go. But then eventually more and more keys are not fitting in more and more doors, and now there's more glucose stuck outside the cells, and so now it's the numbers are higher, and that's where you see that fasting glucose go up, you see that A1C go up, you see the levels go up because there's too much floating around in the bloodstream. Also, this aspect of glucose going up, down all day long because we're eating so much carbs or we're just not managing well is is a source of inflammation. So we talked earlier about
Mm-hmm.
inflammation. That whole mechanism of asking the body to do that over and over all day, even if the process is working effectively, is creating inflammation in our bodies. And so we can have other problems arise just because we're now building inflammation, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for saying that too. Because it's normal for your blood sugar to go up and down throughout the day. Like if you were wearing a CGM and you were watching how you're, and you can speak to this more because I know you've been working with this a lot, but it would be normal to see you eat a meal and your blood sugar goes up, and then once it's been a few hours since your meal, you would start to see that blood sugar come back down. That's normal. But what Kara is talking about is when there's just up and down and up and down and up and down and just these huge spikes and dips all day long, that's considered to be stressful on your body, and that absolutely can contribute to that inflammation. And when we have that inflammation, that's where we're talking about how that can impact some of those downstream effects, like your hormones, for example, is definitely a big thing that comes up. Although inflammation I feel like impacts so many things, right? It's such a big factor in our bodies. So definitely if you find yourself struggling with fatigue, struggling with hormone imbalances of any kind, some of these common but kind of vague symptoms that can come up in our bodies, it's definitely a good place to start is looking at that health.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have to have metabolic syndrome or signs of metabolic syndrome to take a deeper look at your blood sugar and try to
Totally.
optimize there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's definitely becoming more and more common because I know once upon a time, if you saw somebody wearing a CGM, you just assume they're a diabetic and they have to monitor their blood sugar. But what you're really talking about is just people wanting to optimize their health. Maybe they're struggling with a metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance type picture, but maybe there's inflammation going on. Maybe there's some other stuff going on. So I would love if you can speak to that a little bit more, just why it might be useful for somebody to use a CGM. What kind of cases would you be suggesting that for, and how that can be supportive for people?
Yeah. So what's really cool is in the past few years, a lot of the companies that make the CGM monitors for diabetics have made direct to consumer versions so
Mm-hmm.
that anybody can purchase them. So you don't need to be a diabetic. You don't need to have a prescription from your doctor. You can just go onto their website and purchase them. There are two that I've used, the Stello, which is by Dexcom, and the Lingo, which is by Abbott. So those are two companies that make monitors for diabetics, but now they make these versions that you can just order online and they come to your house within 24 hours.
Awesome.
And they're very affordable too. I think they're like $50 about for
Oh,
one
great.
14-day sensor. And so the types of patients that I recommend these for, I'm recommending these at work all the time. And I mentioned earlier, I'm seeing, the gamut here. I'm seeing like 20-year-olds to 80-year-olds. I'm seeing men, I'm
Right.
seeing women. But I'm really recommending them frequently. I think balancing blood sugar is going to be foundational for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
So if I sense that somebody's blood sugar is not balanced, either because of their lab markers or because of just, when I do their intake and I hear about their typical day of eating, or if I suspect that there's like a chronic stress picture going on and that can be the source, like if somebody's experiencing a lot of anxiety or hanger or shakiness or any symptoms like that, I might suspect issues with high and low blood sugar going on. What other reasons? If somebody has a lot of like sleep disruptions, that's another great utilization of a CGM because we can maybe see what's happening to the blood sugar overnight. Is it causing any disruptions in sleep? So, really, it's like anybody can use this. I actually think that it could be part of like anyone's health journey when they're working with a integrative or functional practitioner. There's really no reason not to see what's going on. I mean, if
Yeah.
somebody's really just very balanced in their diet and reports feeling good and doesn't really have many symptoms, then fine. Maybe you're not going to see much there, but that's not the norm, you know? Like it's very rare, especially people that are coming to us that they're saying, "Well, I feel
Hmm.
perfect and great." You know, I think really anyone can benefit from them.
Yeah. And I do think that's a great point that you have, that so many people can benefit from this, because I want to even highlight, Kara and I have had different experiences in our health that have brought us to where we are now in supporting others in their health. But we both have really taken a journey in working on blood sugar. So Kara comes from having PCOS and fertility struggles and all of these things going on. I came from having endometriosis, and yet blood sugar was definitely an important factor for both of us along the way. It's definitely something that I see a lot in my practice. And I want to even mention from my own experience, I I really struggled in my younger years with, feeling hangry, like you mentioned, was definitely a common thing. I really struggled with kind of what we know as practitioners as reactive hypoglycemia, meaning your body just really crashes with the blood sugar on a regular basis. And my mom struggles with the same thing. So I grew up just thinking that this was just how we are, and it's my genetics. That's how I'm built. I just need to keep snacks with me all the time so I don't get hangry. I would get very just irritable and shaky and lightheaded if I didn't eat. It was always a struggle for me. And then lo and behold, when I actually started working on dietary changes, and part of it was what I was eating, of course, making some changes on that front, but honestly, a lot of it was just thinking about my meal timing and spacing. When I was eating breakfast, what I was including in my meals made such a huge difference for me, to the point where now that kind of stuff doesn't happen to me. I mean, sure, if I go way too long, if it's like been 8 hours since I ate a meal, I'm not going to feel great. That's normal. But I can easily have breakfast and then wait 4 or 5 hours and eat lunch and feel absolutely fine in between, and not get that weird, hangry, shaky yuckiness that I used to have. And I think that's so important for people to hear. Like, just because you feel that way now doesn't mean that that's how you have to feel forever. Like,
Yeah.
there's things you can do to support that.
Well, what's so cool about the monitors is it can help you to draw those connections.
Yes.
So you can start to feel shakiness or hanger, and then you open up the app and you're like, oh, I'm having reactive hyperglycemia or low blood sugar, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
now have made that connection. Okay, so my blood sugar is going low. These are the symptoms I'm feeling. This is how long it's been since I ate. And now you understand your unique physiology a lot better, which is
Yeah.
what I work on with a lot of my patients at work. It's like women especially, we're so used to just disassociating with our bodies. We don't want to feel anything. We
Yes.
don't have time. We can't deal
Yes.
with symptoms. Like, I don't, I have a headache. I got to take Advil. I got to make it go away. But instead, what I love to teach my patients is, you get a headache or you get hanger or you get something. Let's stop and think about, why might I be experiencing this, and what might my body be asking for. Symptoms are
Totally.
our body's only way of communicating with us. They're asking for something, right? And so if we start to pay attention to that a little bit more, then we can start to live more in alignment with like what our own body needs.
Yeah.
So you've made the connection now. Okay, this is the start of maybe a drop in blood sugar, and I know exactly what I need to do to stabilize,
Yeah.
right? I, on the other hand, don't really get that. Like, I don't really go low ever. That's not really part of my picture. My blood sugar wants to stay high. And so I
Hmm.
have to work harder to make sure that my carbs are really balanced with my proteins and my fats, and that my carbs come from more whole food carb sources versus processed sources.
Yeah.
Like, my body is very, very sensitive to that. And
Yeah.
so, I'm more paying attention to how do I feel after a meal? Am I feeling like sluggish and tired and bloated because that was really taxing on my blood sugar, or am I feeling energized and feeling good because that kept my blood sugar stable? So I'm kind of
Yeah.
like, using different symptoms that emerge from what I'm eating or doing day to day. That's what I think is really so great about the monitor. It can really help you to understand your own body better. It's so confusing out there, right? There's so much information. And
Yeah.
so, you read, oh, I'm supposed to, eat 50 grams of carbs at breakfast, but
Right.
then you go and do
Right.
it and you're like, I don't feel good, right?
Yes. Yeah,
So, we're all different.
totally. Comes right back to that bio-individuality piece.
Right.
Yeah, figuring out what your body needs. Absolutely. So, since you've been doing some work with this and seen kind of the results of, seeing what's happening on the CGM and then being able to apply some dietary changes to help to support that, I would love if you can just share a couple of examples of what that can look like what kind of things that you'd be seeing and what kind of changes you would make to help to support that. Just some of the common patterns that you see with people.
Yep. I actually met with a patient earlier today that we were talking about this. So it's very fitting. I had one, she had a lot of waking in the night, typically around like the 4 a.m. time, which to me often can be this sign of like a cortisol imbalance. Like your
Yeah.
cortisol is starting to rise too early and it's waking you up. And it can be from stress. It can also be from meal timing the night before. It could be from dinner. It could be from sleep quality. It could be from a lot of different things. But what we were finding for her was that she was actually taking a lot of the advice out there of being like low, low, low carb. So she was super low carb. And so at her dinner, she was eating like basically no carbs at all. And so what was happening that we saw on her CGM was that she would go to bed already with her blood sugar kind of low, and then what would happen is around 3:30 a.m. it would drop and it would
Mm.
go under, it would go very low, like 60s, 50s, something like that. So that hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, what happens is your body sees that as like a dangerous thing that's happening. It doesn't want you to be low blood sugar, so it comes in to rescue it with now increasing cortisol, increasing your stress hormone, which then causes your body to release glucose into your bloodstream to bring it back up.
Yeah.
So it's brought it back up now to a safe place, but what it did was it released cortisol, so it woke her up, right? So now it's 4 a.m. and she's awake and alert and ready to go. And so what we played around with for her, and we met today about it, was really helpful was we added some carbs to her dinner, some whole food based carbs. So, like potatoes or sweet potatoes or some quinoa, things like that. Or if she wasn't really having much of that at dinner, we were adding in a bedtime snack. So, before bedtime, she was having like a little bit of a carb protein based snack. And she's finding that she's not waking in the night anymore. So,
Awesome.
we're suspecting that her blood sugar is more stable. She's not wearing the monitor anymore. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of one way that I think it can be really interesting to see because really her chief complaint was her sleep. It wasn't
Right.
really anything to do with her diet, but she was having that low blood sugar episode
Yep.
overnight. For a lot of other patients that we recommended at work, it's because they have prediabetes or signs of insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, or even type 2 diabetic at that point. And so for that, at that point, the body's really having a hard time managing any kind of carbohydrates. And so, for a lot of those people, we're really looking at what foods specifically are causing them to go high and pulling back on those. So, that could even be from, bananas or grapes or like higher sugar fruits that, they may
Mm-hmm.
need to pull back on. And it's not permanent. We just need to help the body to not be working so hard with that lock and key that we talked about earlier so that it then reverses some of that insulin resistance and then can better tolerate those foods again. So, it's about like temporary pulling back on all the things we're seeing or making you
Yeah.
spike. We'll use it for that too. I actually had two cases that come to mind. I had a couple years ago one client who anytime she'd see her in-laws, she'd see her blood sugar shoot up. So, and she wasn't having a meal or anything like that. Every time she'd see her blood sugar shoot up. And then I had another client who every time he played online poker, he saw his blood sugar shoot up. So those were really interesting because that was talking a lot about like mindset work and stress and nervous system
Mhm.
work and, you know, maybe anytime you're seeing the in-laws, well, we're gonna do like a quick 10-minute meditation or something to like
Sure.
center you or have like a mantra you say to yourself or go on a walk or create better boundaries, totally unrelated to food. And my patient with the online poker, I just thought that was an interesting one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could see that though, because you're, you know, you're intent on I've never done online poker, but I can imagine that you'd be very intent on the game and maybe a little stressed or something.
Right.
So I think that's so important to note too. And we come back to what you were saying earlier, how all the systems in our bodies are so interconnected because yeah, so you had mentioned earlier that when you're talking about your client who was struggling with sleep and waking up, that when the blood sugar dips down, that cortisol is what helps to bring it back up. But cortisol, we also know, is our stress hormone. So you can see right there how there's an interconnectedness between those two pieces. And I think that's so interesting how the stress picture, whatever's happening in your life, can totally impact what's happening in your blood sugar. I think that's such an important thing to note. So it's not just about the diet. What are you doing? What are you seeing? What are you experiencing when you're having those fluctuations? And that's definitely interesting to see that feedback
Right.
and see the real life data on that.
Right. And to bring it full circle, because we were talking about PCOS earlier, you can see how someone having PCOS can be driven by so many different things, right? Because
Mhm.
PCOS is really, for a lot of people, it's that insulin resistance that's
Yep.
then causing this fallout of the hormones. But
Hmm.
what is causing the insulin resistance, right? It can be
Yep.
so many different things. And so it's just not as simple as like, oh, I have PCOS, right?
Yep. 100%. Totally agree with that. Yeah. I love that we're bringing that full circle here. That's awesome. Well, I think this has been such a fantastic conversation, Kara. I think this can be so enlightening for people. I feel like I always learn stuff from having these conversations. That's why this is so much fun for me. Just getting to hear different perspectives and what you've learned from working with people along the way is so much fun. So thank you, thank you, thank you for taking the time to share. So being that this podcast is aligned to rise, which the whole point behind that is that we're bringing our bodies, our minds, our spirits, all the things back into alignment so that you can really rise into your true potential in life. I know that you've had quite a journey in your own health, which you shared with us as far as bringing yourself back into alignment. And now you've been able to step into this wonderful career and help other people along the way. But I love to ask, what do you feel like has been the biggest positive experience that you've gotten for yourself, the best reward that you've gotten for yourself from being able to do that, to bring yourself back into alignment, to feel good into your body, so now that you can really live the life that you want to live? What's that looked like for you?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. I think that for me, a lot of what I've learned has been to trust the process and to
Mm,
trust the journey
yeah.
because I never knew what it was like to really love your career and love what you do
Mm,
until I found this work. But I found it a little later. It's a second career essentially for me. And I was hard on myself for a while that, I wish I discovered this when I was 22 and had all the time in the world and could build a business and do all the things. And, now trying to build a business and have a career and raise kids and everything, it's challenging. But, I think really recognizing that my journey is what shaped me and what got me to this point, and that had I not had that journey, I wouldn't have the perspectives I do, and I wouldn't have gotten here without it. I don't think I would have found this otherwise. So I think really trusting the process and, seeing things through and believing in that, I think there's a lot of power to that. There's just so much in life you can't control. And
yeah.
that's a hard thing for a lot of us to give up, but sometimes you need the time to really have the perspective to look back and say, okay, I get it now.
100%. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's such a beautiful journey that's taken you to where you are. I feel like that's so many of us that this has been a second career, right? It's like your life just leads you to where you're meant to be, I guess. It's kind
Right.
of cool.
It is kind of cool when you think about it like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Kara. It has been such a pleasure having you on the show, and thank you for sharing all of your experiences. I'm sure that people are going to want to connect with you and reach out to you and hear more about what you're doing and the beautiful work that you bring into the world. So we will definitely link all of this in the show notes as well for anybody who is listening while doing other things. But I would love if you can just share where we can find you.
Yep. So you can find me at my website, karabecker.com, or you can find me at my Instagram, Kara Becker Wellness. I'm happy to talk all things health and wellness, all things CGM with any of you. I'm hopefully in the next few months going to be launching some cool CGM-based programs that, I can offer to any prospective
Awesome.
clients.
That's very cool. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Kara. It's been so lovely having this chat. And thank you so much to all of the listeners for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Aligned to Rise. If this episode spoke to you, take a moment to share it with a friend who needs this message too. And then don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'll see you next time, my friend. Let's rise together.